The first lie they told about me was that I was carrying the heir's child. By noon, every news station in New York had my picture. By sunset, strangers were calling me a gold digger. And by midnight, I was standing outside the gates of the Blackwood estate with a single suitcase, watching my entire life collapse behind wrought iron fences taller than any dream I'd ever had. The cameras flashed so brightly they turned the cold evening into a storm of artificial lightning. Reporters shouted questions I couldn't answer. Neighbors recorded videos on their phones. Complete strangers debated my character as if they had known me forever. I gripped the handle of my suitcase until my fingers hurt and stared at the headline glowing across a giant screen mounted on a news van. The Maid, the Heir, and the Scandal. Underneath it was a photograph of me leaving the estate that morning. I looked exhausted. Frightened. Guilty. The truth was much simpler. I was tired. Tired of being judged. Tired of being watched. Tired of secrets I didn't even understand. A security guard opened the gate just enough to place a cardboard box on the sidewalk beside me. The rest of my belongings. A few books. A framed photograph. 2 sweaters. The pieces of a life that suddenly seemed very small. Then the gate closed again. The heavy iron lock clicked into place. Final. Permanent. Like the ending of a story I never agreed to join. Somewhere behind those gates lived Alexander Blackwood. The heir to one of the most powerful families in America. The man everyone believed had ruined my life. The man I couldn't stop thinking about. A reporter pushed forward through the crowd. "Claire. Is the baby his?" More cameras turned toward me. More microphones appeared. I felt my face burn. "There is no baby," I said quietly. Nobody listened. They never do when the truth is less exciting than the rumor. Another voice shouted. "Did he promise to marry you?" Laughter followed. I looked down at the pavement. Rain from an earlier storm still glistened beneath the streetlights. Tiny reflections danced across the concrete like shattered mirrors. For a moment, I saw my own reflection staring back. A maid. A scandal. A headline. Nothing more. At least that's what everyone believed. What they didn't know was that 3 months earlier, I had arrived at Blackwood Manor carrying a cleaning cart and a second-hand suitcase. I wasn't searching for love. I wasn't chasing money. I wasn't trying to change my life. I only needed a job. Just one job. One paycheck. One chance to keep moving forward. If someone had told me then that my name would become front-page news, I would have laughed. If they had told me that Alexander Blackwood would change everything, I would have walked away before ever stepping through those gates. But fate rarely asks permission. And my story with the Blackwoods began on a rainy Monday morning with a simple knock on a mansion door. The first thing I noticed about Blackwood Manor was how quiet it felt. Not peaceful. Not welcoming. Just quiet in the way a museum feels after closing, when every sound seems too loud and every step feels like an interruption. Rain tapped softly against the windows as I stood at the front entrance clutching my second-hand suitcase. The mansion stretched across the hillside like something from another century, all stone walls, towering columns, and windows so tall they reflected the gray morning sky. I checked the address 3 times before ringing the bell. There was no way a place like this needed someone like me. The door opened almost immediately. A woman in a navy suit studied me over thin glasses. Her silver hair was pulled into a perfect knot. Nothing about her appeared accidental. "Claire Bennett?" she asked. I nodded. "You are late." I glanced at my phone. "It is 8 o'clock exactly. Mr. Blackwood prefers people arrive early." She stepped aside. "Come in." The marble floor inside gleamed beneath a chandelier large enough to hang over an entire apartment building. I suddenly became aware of every scuff on my shoes. Every wrinkle in my coat. Every dollar I did not have in my bank account. The woman led me through endless hallways lined with family portraits. Generations of Blackwood stared down from gilded frames. Men in expensive suits. Women wearing jewels that probably cost more than my entire neighborhood. They all looked confident. Untouchable. Like people who had never worried about rent. "You will answer to Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said. "You will not enter the East Wing unless instructed. You will not discuss family matters. You will not ask personal questions." I nodded after each sentence. I needed this job too badly to argue. The housekeeping office sat near the rear of the estate. Mrs. Whitmore turned out to be surprisingly kind. She handed me a uniform and showed me the daily schedule. Dusting. Laundry. Guest rooms. Nothing complicated. By 10 o'clock I was pushing a cleaning cart through the second-floor corridor, trying to remember which rooms had already been serviced. That was when I heard shouting. Not angry shouting. Panicked shouting. Several voices echoed from downstairs. A man called for help. Another voice shouted for someone to call emergency services. The entire house seemed to spring into motion. I left the cart and hurried toward the grand staircase. Staff members were gathering near the foyer. At the bottom of the stairs an older man had collapsed into a chair. One hand pressed against his chest. His face looked pale beneath the crystal lights. A young woman nearby was crying. Nobody seemed to know what to do. Then a deep voice cut through the confusion. Calm. Controlled. Commanding. Move. The crowd parted instantly. I looked up and saw him for the first time. Alexander Blackwood descended the staircase with steady steps and focused eyes. Every person in the room seemed to react to his presence. The panic softened. The noise faded. He knelt beside the older man and immediately took control of the situation. For a moment his gaze lifted. Our eyes met across the crowded foyer. Only a second. Maybe less. But something about that look made my stomach tighten. Then he turned away and said 6 words that changed everything. "Who is the new maid upstairs?" For a second I was convinced he was talking about someone else. There had to be dozens of employees in a house this size. New gardeners. New kitchen staff. New drivers. But every eye in the foyer turned toward me. My stomach dropped. Mrs. Whitmore appeared beside my shoulder so suddenly I almost jumped. "Claire," she said quietly. "Mr. Blackwood is speaking to you." I swallowed and stepped forward. The polished marble seemed impossibly slippery beneath my shoes. Alexander Blackwood watched me approach with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Up close he looked even more intimidating than he had from across the room. Not because he was unfriendly. Because he seemed completely in control. While everyone else was reacting to the emergency, he remained calm. Focused. Like the center of a storm that could not touch him. "You have first aid training?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "A little," I answered. "My mother was a nurse. She taught me basic emergency response when I was younger." His eyes narrowed slightly. Not suspicious. Interested. Good. He turned toward the older man. "Stay with him until the paramedics arrive." Before I could respond, he was already coordinating 3 other people at once. One employee was sent to unlock the front gates. Another was instructed to gather medical information. A third was asked to contact family members. The entire household moved with surprising efficiency. I knelt beside the older gentleman and spoke softly to him while we waited. His breathing gradually steadied. His color improved. Within minutes emergency personnel arrived and took over. The tension that had filled the mansion slowly dissolved. Staff members returned to work. Conversations resumed. The crisis was over. At least for everyone except me. I spent the rest of the afternoon replaying the encounter in my head. Every word. Every glance. Every detail. By dinner I had almost convinced myself it was meaningless. Then Mrs. Whitmore found me folding linens in the laundry room. "Mr. Blackwood would like to see you." The stack of towels nearly slipped from my hands. "Me?" "Immediately." She offered no further explanation. The East Wing was even more impressive than the rest of the estate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked acres of rolling hills. Expensive artwork lined the walls. Family photographs occupied polished tables. Generations of wealth displayed without apology. Mrs. Whitmore stopped outside a pair of dark wooden doors. "Go in." Then she left. I stood there for several seconds staring at the brass handle. Employees were not supposed to enter the East Wing. I had been told that on my first day. Yet here I was. Taking a slow breath, I knocked once and stepped inside. The office was enormous. Shelves filled with books stretched to the ceiling. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Alexander stood near the fireplace reviewing documents. He looked up when I entered. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he closed the folder in his hands and said something I never expected to hear. "Claire, I think you may have saved my grandfather's life today." For a moment I thought I had misheard him. People like Alexander Blackwood did not thank people like me. They certainly did not invite them into private offices to discuss family matters. I shifted my weight and looked down at the polished hardwood floor. "I did not do much," I said. "I only stayed with him until help arrived. Most people freeze during emergencies." His voice remained calm. "You did not." I did not know how to respond to that. The silence stretched between us. Outside, rain rolled down the tall windows in silver streams. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the hills surrounding the estate. Alexander walked toward his desk and placed the folder aside. "My grandfather is recovering well. The doctors expect a full recovery." Relief washed through me. Even though I barely knew the man, I had spent the entire afternoon worrying about him. "That is good news." "It is." His expression softened slightly. "Not much. Just enough to make him seem human instead of untouchable." "How long have you been working here?" "Less than a day." One corner of his mouth almost lifted. "Then your first day has been more eventful than most." Before I could answer, a sharp knock interrupted us. The office door opened without waiting for permission. A woman entered wearing an elegant cream-colored suit. Every detail about her appearance looked carefully controlled. Her posture. Her smile. Even the way she held her handbag. She stopped when she saw me. Her eyes moved from my uniform to Alexander and back again. Something cold flickered behind her expression. "I did not realize you were busy," she said. Alexander's face immediately became unreadable again. "Claire was just leaving." The woman nodded once. "Of course." Her gaze lingered on me for a second longer than necessary. Long enough to make me uncomfortable. I quietly excused myself and headed toward the door. As I passed, she offered a polite smile that somehow felt more like a warning. The hallway outside suddenly seemed easier to breathe in. I started toward the staircase when I heard footsteps behind me. Mrs. Whitmore appeared from around the corner. "Everything all right?" she asked. "I think so." "Good." She adjusted the sleeves of her jacket. "A word of advice, Claire." Something in her tone made me stop walking. "Yes?" "Do your work. Keep your head down. Stay away from family business." My stomach tightened. "I am not involved in family business." "Then keep it that way." She offered a small nod and continued down the hall. I stood there for several seconds watching her disappear around the corner. The warning felt strange. Unnecessary. Yet somehow important. The next morning the estate buzzed with unusual energy. Luxury cars arrived one after another. Staff hurried through hallways carrying documents and trays of coffee. Important meetings were scheduled throughout the day. Everyone seemed nervous except me because I had no idea what was happening. Around noon I was assigned to clean a rarely used library on the third floor. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, scattering colors across the floor. I was dusting a bookshelf when I noticed something sticking out from behind a row of leather-bound volumes. It was a photograph. Old. Faded. Forgotten. I pulled it free and froze. The young woman in the picture looked strangely familiar. Not identical. Not exactly. But enough to send a chill down my spine. Then I noticed the name written neatly across the bottom. Elizabeth Bennet. My breath caught as I stared at the photograph. The woman could not have been older than 25. She stood on the front steps of the estate wearing a simple white dress, sunlight illuminating her smile. There was something familiar about her eyes. Something familiar about the shape of her face. The resemblance was not exact, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I turned the photograph over. The back was yellowed with age. Only one sentence had been written beneath the name. Summer Gala, 1998. I traced the letters with my thumb. Bennett was not a common name, but it was not rare either. Thousands of people shared it across the country. That should have been enough to dismiss the coincidence. Yet I could not. Something about the photograph felt important. Personal. Like a puzzle piece I had not realized was missing. A floorboard creaked behind me. I quickly slipped the photograph back between the books and turned around. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the doorway. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes immediately moved toward the bookshelf. "Finished in here?" she asked. "Almost." She nodded once. "The family is hosting a private dinner tonight. Additional staff will be needed in the dining room." I followed her gaze toward the shelf. For a second I wondered if she knew about the photograph. If she knew about Elizabeth Bennet. But she said nothing more. The opportunity to ask disappeared. By 6 o'clock the estate looked completely different. Crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above polished tables. Fresh flowers filled every room. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway outside. Guests arrived wearing tailored suits and elegant dresses. Wealth seemed to flow through the mansion as naturally as electricity. I helped serve drinks while trying not to attract attention. It was easy. People rarely noticed the staff. They looked through us instead of at us. That changed when I entered the dining room carrying a tray of coffee. A heated conversation was already underway. Not loud enough to be considered an argument. Just tense enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Several members of the Blackwood family sat around the long table. Alexander occupied one end. Across from him sat the woman from his office. Victoria. I had overheard another employee mention her name earlier that day. She smiled often but never seemed warm. "The board expects certainty," Victoria was saying. "Investors do not reward hesitation." Alexander remained calm. "The board hired me to make decisions. That is exactly what I am doing." An uncomfortable silence followed. I lowered my eyes and continued serving coffee. Family business. Stay away from family business. Mrs. Whitmore's warning echoed through my mind. A few minutes later I was collecting empty cups when Alexander unexpectedly spoke. "Claire." Every conversation at the table stopped. My heart nearly stopped with it. "Yes, sir?" His eyes met mine. "The archive inventory project begins tomorrow. I want her assigned to it." Confusion rippled around the table. Victoria's smile disappeared instantly. Then she looked directly at me and asked a question that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "And why exactly are you taking such a special interest in a maid?" The entire room went silent. Even the servers stopped moving. I stood frozen beside the table, suddenly aware that every person in the room was looking at me. Victoria's question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he calmly placed his coffee cup on the table and folded his hands. Because she is organized, detail-oriented, and available, he said. The archive project requires all three. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. Surely there are employees with more experience. There are. Alexander's voice remained steady. They are already assigned elsewhere. Nobody argued after that. Nobody except Victoria, who seemed to be choosing her next words carefully. Eventually she forced a smile and lifted her wine glass. The conversation moved on. But I could still feel her attention following me around the room. The next morning I reported to the archive wing shortly after 8. The archive occupied an older section of the estate that most staff rarely entered. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of boxes filled with documents, letters, photographs, and records lined the walls. The air smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. A retired librarian named Mr. Dawson supervised the project. He handed me a pair of white gloves and explained the process. Every document would be catalogued. Every photograph scanned. Every record preserved. It sounded simple enough. By noon I had already sorted dozens of family files. Most contained financial reports and legal correspondence. Nothing particularly interesting. Then I opened a box labeled Personal Collection. Inside were photographs spanning decades. Birthday parties. Weddings. Vacations. Generations of Blackwoods smiling beneath summer sunlight. I carefully removed one photograph after another until something caught my eye. The same woman. Elizabeth Bennet. This time she stood beside an older Blackwood family member during what appeared to be a charity event. She looked comfortable. Familiar. As if she belonged there. I checked the back of the photograph. No explanation. No notes. Only a date. June 14, 1999. A strange feeling settled over me. Why did her name keep appearing? Why did she look so familiar? Before I could think further, footsteps echoed through the room. I quickly returned the photograph to the box. Alexander appeared between two towering shelves. He was not wearing a suit today. Just a dark sweater and rolled-up sleeves. Somehow that made him seem even more intimidating. More real. "How is the project going?" he asked. "Good." My voice sounded smaller than I intended. He glanced at the stacks of organized files. "Mr. Dawson says you are working faster than anyone expected." "I like organizing things." A faint smile appeared. Brief. Unexpected. "That makes one of us." The moment felt surprisingly normal. Then his attention shifted toward the open box beside me. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. "What were you looking at?" he asked. I hesitated. For some reason I thought about hiding it. Instead I held up the photograph. "Do you know who Elizabeth Bennet was?" The color immediately drained from his face. And for the first time since I met him, Alexander Blackwood looked genuinely shocked. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The archive suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. The dust hanging in the sunlight seemed frozen in place. Alexander stared at the photograph in my hand as though it had appeared out of nowhere. His reaction only deepened the questions already spinning through my mind. "You know her," I said softly. He looked away first. Toward the tall windows. Toward the rows of shelves. Anywhere except the photograph. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In one of the family boxes." His jaw tightened. Not with anger. With something closer to concern. "There are thousands of records in this archive. You happen to find that one?" "Actually, I found two." His eyes immediately returned to mine. The silence that followed felt heavy. Important. Like we had accidentally stepped into a conversation neither of us was supposed to have. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Alexander took the photograph from my hand and slipped it back into the folder. By the time Mr. Dawson entered the room, every trace of emotion had disappeared from his face. The moment was gone. Just like that. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I tried to focus on inventory sheets and catalog numbers, but my mind kept returning to Elizabeth Bennet. Who was she? Why did Alexander react that way? And why did I feel as though her name somehow mattered to me personally? Around 5 o'clock I finally left the archive wing. Rain clouds had gathered outside again, turning the sky gray. I walked through the east garden toward the employee residence building, enjoying the cool air after hours spent indoors. That was when I noticed the black sedan. It sat parked near the service entrance. The engine was running. The windows were dark. I would have ignored it completely except for one detail. As I walked, the driver appeared to be watching me. A strange feeling crawled up my spine. I told myself I was imagining things. Rich families had security. Security used cars. It meant nothing. Still, I quickened my pace. The next morning things became even stranger. The estate was buzzing before breakfast. Staff members whispered in corners. Housekeepers checked their phones every few minutes. Even Mrs. Whitmore looked unusually tense. When I entered the kitchen, 2 employees abruptly stopped talking. They exchanged a glance and looked away. What happened? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, one of the younger servers slid her phone across the table toward me. My stomach dropped. A photograph filled the screen. Alexander and me. Standing together in the archive room the previous afternoon. The angle made us appear far closer than we actually were. A headline stretched across the top of the article. Blackwood Heir spends private time with mysterious Maid. Beneath it were dozens of comments. Speculation. Rumors. Assumptions. My hands began to shake. This cannot be real, I whispered. But it was real. Someone had taken the photograph. Someone had sent it to the press. And judging by the speed it was spreading, the story was only beginning. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A woman's voice greeted me immediately. Calm. Polished. Familiar. Claire, Victoria said. I think it is time we had a private conversation. My hand tightened around the phone. The noise of the kitchen faded into the background. Staff members continued whispering around me, but all I could hear was Victoria's calm voice. Where? I asked. The West Conservatory. 15 minutes. Then the line went dead. I stared at the screen for several seconds before slipping the phone into my pocket. Every instinct told me not to go. Every warning I had received since arriving at the estate echoed through my mind. Stay away from family business. Keep your head down. Do your work. Yet somehow I found myself walking toward the conservatory anyway. The room sat on the far side of the property beneath a glass ceiling covered with rain droplets. Exotic plants filled the space with shades of green. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air. Victoria stood near a stone fountain waiting for me. She looked perfectly composed. As if she had not spent the morning watching rumors about me spread across the internet. Thank you for coming, she said. I folded my arms. Why am I here? She smiled politely. Because your life is about to become much more complicated. I said nothing. Victoria reached into her handbag and removed several printed articles. Every one of them contained my photograph. More headlines. More speculation. More lies. This will continue, she said. Reporters enjoy stories like this. There is no story. Truth has never been a requirement. The answer unsettled me because it sounded genuine. She stepped closer. You seem like a nice young woman, Claire. That is why I am giving you advice. Advice. The word felt strange coming from her. Leave the estate. I blinked. What? Take a generous severance package. Move somewhere quiet. Start over. Her voice remained calm. This attention will eventually disappear. I stared at her. Why do you care? For the first time her smile faltered. Only slightly. Because some situations become dangerous to reputations. There it was. Not concern. Reputation. Image. Control. I finally understood. This conversation was not about helping me. It was about protecting the Blackwood name. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed across the stone floor. Alexander entered the conservatory. His gaze immediately shifted between Victoria and me. The temperature in the room seemed to change. Victoria recovered first. Perfect timing. Alexander looked at me. Are you all right? The simple question caught me off guard. Nobody had asked that all day. Not the reporters. Not the staff. Not even myself. Victoria sighed softly. You see? This is exactly the problem. Alexander ignored her. Claire, come with me. We left the conservatory together. Neither of us spoke until we reached the library. Rain tapped against the windows. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Finally he turned toward me. Do not listen to her. Then tell me what is happening. My voice came out stronger than I expected. Why are reporters following me? Why was that photograph taken? Why does everyone act like I am part of something I do not understand? Alexander remained silent for several seconds. Then he walked toward an old cabinet and removed a worn leather folder. His expression had become serious again. Focused. Determined. Because, he said quietly, placing the folder in my hands, someone does not want you discovering what is inside this file. The leather folder felt heavier than it should have. Rain tapped softly against the library windows as I stared down at it. Alexander stood across from me, watching carefully. Not pressuring me. Just waiting. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the cover. Inside were copies of letters, photographs, and legal documents dating back more than 20 years. The first page contained a name I already recognized. Elizabeth Bennet. My heart skipped. I turned the page. Then another. Then another. Each document seemed to raise more questions than answers. Elizabeth had worked for the Blackwood family years ago. Not as a guest. Not as a relative. As an employee. Just like me. Several photographs showed her attending family events. Standing beside members of the household. Smiling. Trusted. Included. The similarities felt impossible to ignore. Who was she? I asked quietly. Alexander walked to the window before answering. Someone my grandfather cared about. That was not enough. We both knew it. I pulled another document from the folder. This one appeared to be part of a legal filing. Several sections had been redacted. Entire paragraphs blacked out. But one line remained visible. Custody agreement. My pulse quickened. Why are parts missing? Alexander hesitated. Because someone removed them years ago. The answer sent a chill through me. Victoria? He did not answer directly. Which felt like an answer. I continued reading. Toward the back of the folder I found a faded hospital record. The paper had yellowed with age. A birth date was listed near the top. Then my eyes found the surname. Bennet. My breathing stopped. The date matched my birthday exactly. For several seconds I could not move. Could not think. Could not speak. The room seemed to tilt around me. Alexander. My voice barely worked. Why is my birthday on this document? He slowly turned toward me. Whatever he saw in my face seemed to confirm something. Because I think someone wanted these records hidden. I stared at him. What are you saying? Before he could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the room. The door opened. Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying an envelope. Her expression looked unusually tense. This just arrived, she said. Special delivery. Alexander accepted the envelope and immediately frowned. There was no return address. Only my name written across the front in elegant handwriting. Claire Bennett. My stomach tightened. I had never received mail at the estate. Not once. Alexander handed it to me. Open it. The paper felt cold beneath my fingers. Inside was a single folded letter and a business card. The card belonged to a law office in Manhattan. The letter contained only one sentence. If you want the truth about Elizabeth Bennet, come alone. Then I saw the signature at the bottom. The name belonged to the family's former attorney. A man who had supposedly retired 15 years earlier. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elizabeth Bennet's photograph. The hospital record. The hidden documents. The questions that refused to leave me alone. By sunrise, rain clouds had settled over Manhattan. The city looked gray through the taxi window as I made my way toward the law office listed on the card. Alexander had offered to come with me. I refused. The letter had been clear. Come alone. Besides, part of me needed answers that belonged only to me. The office occupied the top floor of an older building overlooking Bryant Park. The receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself. That alone made my pulse quicken. Someone had been expecting me. Moments later, I was escorted into a private conference room lined with dark wood shelves and framed legal certificates. An elderly man stood beside the window. His silver hair was neatly combed. His posture remained straight despite his age. He turned when I entered. For several seconds he simply stared at me. The expression on his face was not surprise. It was recognition. You have her eyes, he said quietly. My stomach tightened. Elizabeth? He nodded. Exactly like hers. I sat down slowly. Who was she? The old attorney lowered himself into the chair across from me. His hands rested on a worn leather folder. Another folder. Another collection of secrets. Elizabeth Bennet worked for the Blackwood family many years ago, he said. But that is not the important part. I waited. The silence felt endless. Finally he opened the folder. Inside were copies of legal documents. Birth records. Court filings. Private correspondence. Paper someone had tried very hard to hide. 24 years ago, he continued, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter. My heartbeat became painfully loud. What happened to her? His eyes met mine. Compassion filled them. Regret too. The child disappeared from all official family records less than 6 months later. I felt the room tilt. Disappeared? He nodded. The records were sealed. Names were altered. Custody arrangements were changed. My throat tightened. Why? The attorney looked toward the rain-streaked window. Because certain people believed that child represented a threat to the future of the Blackwood family. The words landed like stones. Heavy. Impossible. I stared at him. What does any of this have to do with me? For the first time since I arrived, the old man hesitated. Then he slid a single document across the table. My hands trembled as I picked it up. At the top was an official seal. Beneath it was a genetic test report dated nearly 2 decades earlier. I scanned the page once. Then twice. Then a third time because my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The report identified the missing child. The report identified Elizabeth Bennet as the mother. And beside the child's name was my name. Claire Bennett. I looked up slowly. The attorney's voice barely rose above a whisper. Claire, you were never just an employee in that house. You were always part of the family. The world seemed to disappear around me. The office. The rain. The city beyond the glass. Everything faded beneath the weight of those words. Part of the family. I stared at the document in my hands until the letters blurred together. My name remained there. Official. Permanent. Impossible to explain away. No, I whispered. There has to be a mistake. The attorney slowly shook his head. I spent years believing there was one. He slid another document across the table. There was not. I looked down. This time it was a collection of correspondence between family advisors and legal representatives. Dates. Signatures. Confidential notes. One phrase appeared again and again. Protect the succession plan. Protect the family legacy. Protect the future heir. My stomach tightened. Alexander? The attorney nodded. At the time, the family feared complications regarding inheritance rights. The room felt colder. So they erased me? He closed his eyes briefly. Someone did. Silence settled between us. Heavy and uncomfortable. Eventually I gathered the documents and placed them back inside the folder. My hand still trembled. Does Alexander know all of this? Not everything. The answer surprised me. He discovered fragments. Photographs. Missing records. Contradictions. But many files disappeared before he could access them. That explained the archive. The hidden documents. The questions he had been asking. He had been searching too. Just as the meeting ended, the attorney handed me one final envelope. You should have this. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph I had never seen before. A young Elizabeth Bennet stood smiling beneath a summer sky. Beside her stood an elderly man I immediately recognized from the portraits throughout the estate. Theodore Blackwood. Alexander's grandfather. His arm rested protectively around her shoulders. They looked happy. Familiar. Like family. Written across the back was a short note. For Elizabeth and Claire. Family always finds its way home. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. An hour later I returned to the estate carrying answers I never wanted and questions I could not escape. The moment I stepped through the front doors, I knew something was wrong. Staff members were gathered near televisions. Phones rang constantly. Security personnel moved through the halls with unusual urgency. Mrs. Whitmore hurried toward me. Relief flashed across her face when she saw me. "Where have you been?" she asked. "What happened?" She handed me a tablet without answering. The headline on the screen nearly stopped my heart. Blackwood family hides secret relative for decades. Beneath the headline sat a photograph of Elizabeth Bennet. Another of me. Another of Alexander. The story had exploded. Every major outlet was carrying it. The secret was no longer hidden. Someone had leaked everything. Before I could process what I was seeing, a familiar voice echoed from the staircase above. "Claire." I looked up. Alexander stood there holding a stack of papers. His expression was grim. Determined. Focused. Like a man who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle. Then he said the one thing that changed everything again. "I know who leaked the story. And I can prove it was Victoria." The next 48 hours felt like a lifetime compressed into 2 days. Reporters crowded outside the estate gates from sunrise until well after midnight. Television trucks lined the road. Every business channel discussed the Blackwood family. Every newspaper seemed to have a different theory. Some called me a forgotten heir. Others called me an opportunist. Most of them did not know the truth. Neither did I. Not completely. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. Every major shareholder would attend. Every senior family member would be present. And for the first time in decades, secrets that had remained buried would be forced into the light. The boardroom occupied the highest floor of Blackwood Tower in Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Clouds hung low over the skyline. The atmosphere inside felt even heavier. I sat near the back beside Mrs. Whitmore while directors, attorneys, and advisors filled the room. Victoria appeared confident when she entered. Elegant as always. Perfectly composed. She greeted investors with practiced smiles. Anyone looking at her would have seen complete control. Then Alexander walked in carrying 3 thick binders. The room immediately quieted. He did not waste time with introductions. He did not deliver a speech. He simply connected a laptop to the presentation screen and began showing evidence. Internal emails. Financial records. Archived communications. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. For years, information regarding Elizabeth Bennet and her daughter had been intentionally hidden. Several records had been altered. Others had disappeared entirely. More importantly, Alexander revealed evidence showing who had authorized many of those actions. Victoria's confidence slowly vanished. The room grew silent as page after page appeared on the screen. One shareholder removed his glasses and stared in disbelief. Another repeatedly shook his head. The family attorney sitting beside the board chairman looked physically exhausted. Finally Victoria stood. "This is absurd," she said. "These accusations are based on assumptions." Alexander calmly opened the final binder. "No." His voice remained steady. "They are based on signatures." He displayed a series of documents bearing Victoria's authorization. The dates stretched across years. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Several directors exchanged stunned looks. Others immediately began reviewing copies placed before them. For the first time, Victoria seemed unsure. Her eyes moved around the room searching for support. None came. Then something unexpected happened. Theodore Blackwood slowly rose from his chair. The entire room became still. Even at his age, his presence commanded respect. He looked directly at Victoria before turning toward me. His expression carried sadness, regret, and something else. Relief. "The Blackwood family failed Claire Bennet," he said quietly. "We failed her mother. And we failed ourselves." Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. Theodore's gaze swept across the room. "Today that ends." The vote happened less than 30 minutes later. By unanimous decision, all restrictions surrounding the hidden records were removed. Independent investigators were authorized to review decades of sealed documents. Victoria was stripped of her remaining authority within the family organization. When the meeting finally ended, people slowly began leaving the room. Conversations erupted everywhere. Reporters waited downstairs. Lawyers made calls. Advisors hurried through hallways. Yet I remained frozen in place. Everything had changed. Then Theodore approached me, placed a small antique key in my hand, and said something that left me speechless. "Claire, there is one more thing your mother wanted you to find." 3 days later, I stood in front of a locked door hidden behind the oldest wing of Blackwood Manor. The antique key Theodore had given me felt warm in my hand despite the cool autumn air. Dust covered the brass handle. It looked as though nobody had opened the room in years. Maybe decades. My heart pounded as I turned the key. The lock clicked softly. The door opened inward. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, illuminating a room frozen in time. Books lined the shelves. Fresh white paint had faded into cream. A small rocking chair sat beside the window. And on the desk rested dozens of carefully organized boxes. I stepped inside slowly. Every object seemed to whisper a memory I had never lived. Then I noticed a letter resting at the center of the desk. My name was written across the envelope. Claire. My breath caught. Trembling fingers opened the seal. The handwriting inside matched notes I had already seen in the archive. Elizabeth Bennet. My mother. I sat beside the window and began to read. She wrote about hope. About mistakes. About dreams for a daughter she feared she might never see grow up. She described a little girl with curious eyes and a stubborn heart. She wrote about wanting me to know that my worth would never come from money, family names, or inheritance. It would come from kindness, integrity, courage. By the time I reached the final page, tears blurred the words. The last sentence was underlined twice. If life ever brings you home, choose love over legacy. I read it 3 times. Maybe 4. Then I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. A soft knock interrupted the silence. I turned. Alexander stood in the doorway. He had removed his suit jacket. For once he looked less like the future head of an empire and more like a man carrying the weight of one. His eyes found the letter in my hands. You found it. I nodded. For a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet felt comfortable now. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just honest. He stepped into the room and glanced around. My grandfather always believed this room should belong to you one day. I laughed softly through my tears. A month ago I was cleaning guest rooms. A faint smile appeared on his face. A month ago I was trying to solve a mystery. Sunlight spilled across the floor between us. Outside, golden leaves drifted across the estate grounds. Everything looked different. Not because the mansion had changed. Because I had. What happens now? I asked. Alexander looked out the window before answering. That depends on what you want. It was the first time anyone had asked me that since this journey began. Not what the family wanted. Not what the board wanted. Not what the media wanted. Me. I thought about the headlines. The secrets. The inheritance. Then I thought about my mother's letter. Choose love over legacy. I smiled. I want a future that belongs to me. Alexander's expression softened. Good. He extended his hand. Then let us build one. I took it. Not because of the family name. Not because of the estate. Not because of the fortune attached to it. I took it because for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. And sometimes the greatest inheritance is not wealth. It is finally discovering the truth about who you are and finding people who love you anyway.